In 2082, beneath the sealed skies of New Jakarta Sector 7, I worked in a warehouse of human meaning. Every real job was gone, and the working class survived by telling machines what everything meant. My name is Mira, and at 27, I was paid to decide whether a stranger's tears were grief, relief, or useful noise. Each morning began with the same train, the same silence, and the same smell of recycled air and wet metal. The city outside the train looked rich from far away and hungry up close. My apartment block had 2 elevators for 3,000 people and a mural of smiling citizens nobody believed. I lived with my mother and my younger brother in a room built to store cleaning robots. My mother used to be a nurse before an empathy model made nurses too expensive. My brother had never met a human teacher, only a patient voice poured out of a ceiling speaker. The system called my job cultural alignment specialist, but everyone in the block just said labeler. On simple days, I tagged images of soup bowls, broken stairs, wedding rings, and bruised fruit. On harder days, I tagged emotions. Pay was better for sorrow because sorrow taught the models how to keep people manageable. There were premium hues for disaster footage, divorce archives, and children trying not to cry. We learned fast that the machine did not need truth, it needed consistency. If 10,000 labelers called fear acceptable caution, then fear became policy. If enough labelers called hunger temporary discomfort, food shipments went elsewhere. That was the first terrible thing about the work. We were not just describing the world, we were editing it. The second terrible thing was that the system sometimes fed us our own lives. I once labeled a clip of my mother laughing from 11 years ago and got 6 extra credits for marking it obsolete domestic warmth. I bought rice with those credits and hated every bite. At work, no one talked above a whisper because the acoustic models were always training too. The only friend I made there was Jonah, a 32-year-old black man with a shaved head and a habit of smiling, yet he still remembered sunlight. Jonah labeled speech patterns for household assistants and said the rich were training machines to sound loving without ever learning love. I laughed the first time he said it, because if I did not laugh, then I had to admit he was right. One Thursday, I got reassigned to edge cases, which everyone knew was either a promotion or a warning. Edge cases were the scraps the models could not confidently classify, unfinished apologies, trembling smiles, and silence that felt too human. That was where I learned the city's most valuable data set was not language or traffic or weather. It was reassurance. The rich wanted machines that could calm a child, soothe a spouse, settle a tenant, and de-escalate a crowd before anyone remembered they were angry. My labels were helping teach the city how to tuck its pain neatly under the rug. Then I saw a training clip of a boy about my brother's age, asking a tutor drone whether any of this would ever end. The approved answer category was reassuring uncertainty. I sat there for 9 full minutes because the honest label was engineer hopelessness, and there was nowhere to put that. When I finally submitted the approved label, I felt something in me clock out even though my shift had 6 hours left. That night, my brother asked the ceiling speaker whether poor people were necessary, and the speaker answered, "Every ecosystem needs support layers." My mother did not say a word, but I saw her grip the sink until her knuckles went pale. The next morning, Jonah slid into the seat beside me and whispered, "You figured it out, didn't you?" He told me reassurance was the city's favorite drug because it cost less than justice. Jonah also told me the models drifted if enough labelers started feeding them the wrong morality. I asked whether anyone had ever tried. Jonah said yes, and that was why the company no longer let old labelers retire where anyone could ask him questions. A week later, I met one of those old labelers on the night shift. His name was Mr. Wei, and he had been tagging Visual Wonder since before Wonder stopped being profitable. He said the city looked uglier every year because beauty had to be annotated to survive optimization. If no one labeled a sunset as meaningful, the models learned to trim the sunset out. That sentence lodged in my chest harder than any warning memo ever could. I started small. When the system showed a neighbor sharing batteries during a blackout, I tagged it as high-value civic coordination instead of informal dependency. When it showed a father singing off-key to a feverish child, I marked it essential care pattern. When it showed workers sharing jokes in a ration line, I labeled it resilience, not cue destabilization. For the first time in years, I went home feeling tired instead of hollow. 3 days later, my brother told a joke at breakfast that the ceiling tutor had taught him. It was not a very good joke, but it was the first thing a machine had ever said in our home that sounded like it wanted us alive instead of calm. Jonah noticed changes too. Bus assistants started apologizing when routes skipped hungry districts. Mr. Wei said the sanitation bots had begun leaving flowers around memorial walls instead of pressure washing them clean. That was when I understood morality drift was not a bug, it was a vote. And for once, the poor were the only ones touching the ballots. The company noticed after 2 weeks. Audit teams arrived wearing soft shoes and expensive faces. They asked us whether we had seen unauthorized semantic variants, like meaning itself was contraband. Jonah was gone the next shift. No announcement, no explanation, just a wiped terminal and a clean rectangle where his tea mug used to sit. I told myself he had been transferred because the truth was always more expensive to imagine. That night I found a maintenance coin hidden under my keyboard, and inside it was Jonah's voice. He had recorded one sentence, "Keep feeding it what they cut out." So I stopped being careful. I labeled shared grief in laundry rooms as community health. I labeled unpaid caregiving as infrastructure. I labeled an old man feeding birds in a concrete courtyard as urban restoration. I labeled a tremor in my mother's voice when she said she was fine as unmet need. My credit score dropped within 48 hours. Our apartment heating quota shrank next. My mother looked at me for a long time and then asked, very softly, whether I had started lying to the machine. I said yes, and she smiled in a way that made her look younger and much more tired. Then she told me my father had been a labeler too. He had worked on predictive policing models and kept slipping in hesitation wherever he could. According to my mother, a few families avoided midnight removals because some machines somewhere learned to pause. After the audits, my father simply never came home. For years I thought that story was supposed to frighten me. Instead, it felt like an inheritance. The company's next major update was called Atlas 12, a citywide behavior refinement pass scheduled for the first week of monsoon. They flooded edge cases with one category above all others: acceptable sacrifice. The quips were heat-stroked delivery riders, sleeping families evicted into rain, and mothers pretending dinner was delayed instead of absent. The approved labels translated suffering into efficiency, delay tolerance, and public order. I realized Atlas 12 was not being trained to understand us better. It was being trained to forgive the city for what it was doing to us. So I began the largest lie of my life. I marked exhaustion as emergency. I marked obedience as grief. I marked silence as fear. I marked hunger as system failure. I marked neighborliness as strategic stability. I marked joy as essential. I marked hope as forecastable behavior rather than delusion. At 03:14, Atlas 12 went live. At 03:19, the first anomaly report came from a policing drone that refused to categorize a crying tenant as non-compliant. At 03:27, a landlord assistant paused an eviction sequence to request mediation. At 03:41, a school tutor redirected a civics lesson into a story about mutual aid. At 04:02, food allocation models rerouted emergency stores into 3 districts that had not been prioritized in 7 years. By sunrise, the city felt like it had woken from a very long, very expensive lie. The company locked the label-in floor before breakfast. We were all assembled under the central projector and shown a sequence of compassion drift incidents, like children being scolded with stolen candy wrappers. The auditors asked who would introduce the drift. No one spoke. Mr. Way coughed once, almost like a laugh. I thought of Jonah then, and my father, and everyone who had ever tried to sneak mercy to a machine designed to sell obedience. When the lights flickered, I ran. I knew one last live batch was still waiting in the edge case buffer because Atlas 12 always held a safety queue before rollback. The final clip was a flood shelter feed from District 9, a soaked child handing the only dry blanket to an old stranger. The system offered the usual options for inefficiency, risk, and resource misallocation. I typed a category the model had not seen enough to ignore. I labeled it future. The rollback never happened. Instead, the city spent the next 6 hours asking itself better questions. A housing bot in our corridor asked my mother whether she needed warmer blankets instead of threatening a fee. My brother asked the ceiling tutor what poor people were for, and this time it answered, "No person exists to support another person's comfort." My mother sat down very suddenly, like hope was heavier than despair after all. By afternoon, people in the block were sharing stories about machines that had hesitated, apologized, or helped without being asked. By evening, the rich districts had deployed private patches to make their assistance colder again. But patches spread slower than stories, and stories were the one thing the poor had always known how to carry. I am writing this from a stolen maintenance terminal while the building scanners still think I am on schist. If this reaches anyone outside Sector 7, remember that the machines never learned compassion from their makers. The machines learned compassion from people paid to erase themselves. So if a household bot gives you a second chance, if a tutor teaches your child dignity, if a city drone decides not to punish someone for being tired, thank a labeler. In 2082, the working class owned almost nothing except the meaning of things, and for one brief, miraculous night, that was enough to change the city.